Hello and welcome back to Paper Lives, the podcast where we peel back the decaying pages of the long forgotten newspapers and journals to find fragile stories and to bring them to life once again. Today we will be visiting London in 1972, a hotbed for countercultural icons, diverse viewpoints and at this point, rather congested roads. Here we will grab a pint at the Champion pub in trendy Notting Hill, where we will meet gay liberation figures and bear witness to a rather strange altercation within the pub. After this, our journey will take us to the local magistrate's court, where we will hear a rather unique case. Within the pages of the local straight press and the gay countercultural press, we will assume both an insider and outsider position to better understand the challenges faced by London's vibrant and diverse gay community at this vital point in queer history.
What a gay day Marylebone Court had last Tuesday,
jokingly reported the 3rd of November edition of the local newspaper the Marylebone Mercury. The headline above the article read, "Kisses and Bubbles at Marylebone." Now if you were just glancing through the newspaper, you would be forgiven for assuming that this was a report on a grand festival, a joyous parade and probably even the Notting Hill Carnival. But beneath this playful facade lies a serious story of discrimination, community infighting, and queer diversity. The day at the court reportedly
started with good-natured fun when a man in drag clothing fanned soap bubbles at the magistrate and blew kisses at the court police staff. But it ended with a vicious brawl when police clashed with angry members of the gay liberation group.
The so-called brawl in the courtroom corridors broke out between the police and gay rights activists after men in so-called drag clothing from the public gallery burst into laughter during the cross-examination of Police Constable North, who said that the two accused had been, quote, properly dressed, unquote, in male clothes at the time of the incident. Evidently, the idea that male clothes equated to proper dress was, amongst these avant-garde practitioners of the drag arts, considered rather humorous, but the good-natured humour that the judge was willing to tolerate had apparently been surpassed. The Mercury vaguely sketched out the scene.
After the fights in the court corridors, members of the public were allowed back into the gallery.
And with that, the Mercury's reporting on the unique proceedings of the day ended, giving way to an account of the alleged course of events that brought that day to pass. The gay day was simply a sideshow, a bit of queer window dressing to the sober case reporting that was central to such local, so-called straight reportage. This particular account told a story of internal prejudice and conflict within London's burgeoning gay community, even if the Mercury was not alert to such a fact.
At issue, officially, was whether some gay liberationists had used threatening language and or behaviour at the Champion Public House, Notting Hill Gate, on September the 15th. At issue, unofficially, was whether a landlord is entitled to refuse drinks to customers in drag purely on the grounds of sartorial prejudice.
Bob Sturgis wrote this in the December edition of Lunch, the short-lived magazine of the Campaign for Homosexual Equality gay rights group. Che, for short, was a leading light in the battle for gay rights throughout the 1970s, and you can see it as a more moderate contemporary of the short-lived but greatly influential gay liberation front. Sturgis's account did not need to catch the wandering eye of the outsider with fanciful promises of a gay day in Marylebone, as did the Mercury. His article was prefaced with only the words gay trial. Lunch may have been gaining traction as a national magazine in 1972. It may have begun to be stocked in kiosks across the nation, but its growing readership was almost exclusively queer. This brought about a sort of insider status for the readership of this particular magazine. There was a vernacular that was ubiquitous within the target community. Words like drag, Phrases like gay trial, notions like you old queen, which we'll get onto in a little bit, they don't need to be specified, they don't need to be explored, explained to the audience. You get a sense of linguistic solidarity within this. Sturgis described himself as
a member of London Chair who has written and spoken on homophile and allied subjects. On graduating in law at Cambridge, I became a journalist, and I contribute articles on the theatre scene to various publications.
As a learned man and committed campaigner for homosexual equality, Sturgis was the perfect queer counterbalance to the blinkered account of the so-called straight press, narrating his own paper life of the trial that he saw. Through the straight press and gay press accounts, we can begin to piece together what happened on that chilly September evening outside the Champion pub in Notting Hill. As we heard Sturgis say, the case at hand was officially regarding the alleged threatening behaviour and language used by the couple Andrew Lumsden and Peter Reid towards pub landlord Thomas Mahone and attending police officers. The Champion pub lies on the end of the glamorous Notting Hill Gate, in the heart of the famous Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Today, the pub is frequented by a healthy mix of tourists, locals and foreign emissaries working in the nearby embassies. In 1972, however, it was the champion of London's vibrant gay pub scene. During the cross-examination, the landlord Thomas Mahon, quote, admitted that he ran a gay homosexual pub, but said that he objected to serving people in drag clothing, unquote. Now, it might seem at first a little bit redundant to say gay and homosexual right next to each other, but there's not much more we can expect from an outsider newspaper.
On a night of the disturbances, 3 or 4 men in women's clothes entered my pub and ordered drinks. The number swelled to around 20. Not all were wearing drag, but I refused to serve any of them. My regulars were upset, so I told the group to leave within 10 minutes. They didn't, so I called the police.
One of the defendants, Peter Reid, countered this narrative.
The landlord was aggressive. He was impolite to our friends. I was asked to leave, but refused because this was a gay pub. Police took me out, despite my protest.
Andrew Lumsden, the other defendant, had his recollections of the night, but they were only reflected within Sturgis's account. When the pub landlord entered the witness box, he, according to Sturgis, appealed mild enough, but Lumsden's questioning, in his capacity as his own legal representative, made entirely credible that he had said things like,
"You're revolting, you're not men, I'll give anything to kick you lot in the face."
What followed was an insightful exchange between the two gay men, both offering up wildly different views of homosexual masculinity.
"You're prejudiced, aren't you?"
said Lumsden to Mahone. "No," he replied.
"You've made very free with the word drag, haven't you?"
With that, the confused magistrate repeated the word drag in a questioning tone. "I'm giving to understand that it alludes to articles of female attire, your worship," answered the prosecution lawyer. Lumsden continued.
"Do you know what drag is, Mr. Mahone?"
"Yes, I do." As Sturgis put it,
at this point, Andrew got Michael, his legal advisor, to stand on the dock bench, his bare knees showing prominently under what to the layman appeared to be a white bedsheet. "Is that drag, Mr. Mahone?"
"Yes," replied the landlord.
"Well, it's not. It's a kaftan. It's worn by male Arabs. That shows how little you know about drag."
Within this exchange, we find 3 different and distinct understandings of drag. For Lumsden, the men in drag who entered the Champion for a pint, drag was the practice of cross-dressing, a light-hearted way to express one's own creativity through challenging gender norms. We may expect for a self-described gay homosexual pub to be accepting of such a practice, but within Mahone's response, we see a second understanding of drag. He saw it as an aberration. We see within his words of "you're revolting, you're not real men," that He saw the men in drag as lesser in their masculinity because of their sartorial practices. He saw them as an aberration. To challenge the gender norms that were prevalent in the time, in his mind, was therefore unnatural. Now, it might be surprising to hear this from a gay pub operator, but in 1972, these incongruous views, supposedly incongruous views, had quite a bit of currency at what was a time of flux for London's queer community. The final understanding, or rather misunderstanding of drag that comes from this, is from His Worship Mr. Kenneth Harrington, the presiding magistrate. When he asked for clarification, Harrington's confusion at the mention of the term drag represents a disinterested position of confusion, but perhaps it can link to a sense of curiosity that was within the general public. We can see a curiosity amongst the general public in the report of the Marylebone Mercury. Within that report, there's a general sense of otherness that's combined with the joy of the spectacle. The art of drag was good-natured fun before the violence broke out later, and the way that the men in drag were described mirrors what we could see as an outlandish fashion show. Richard Chappell wore an ankle-length black satin dress with a matching pillbox hat and net veil. Douglas MacDougall wore a pink polka dot dress with green glitter around the eyes, whilst Peter Bourne wore, to great effect, a red patterned velvet dress. What emerges then is a tripartite understanding of drag, from both within and without a queer community. Within, it might be seen with adulation and celebration, or it could be met with outward hostility. Without, it might be met with confusion or revulsion, or it could be met with a joyous curiosity, akin to that experienced as the famous pantomime dame enters the stage in all her outlandish glory. Interestingly, we find the exact same fashion roll call reproduced word for word in both straight and gay accounts. It's not clear if Sturgis looked to the local press for inspiration, or if he relied upon similar reports for his recollection. It makes sense though. Sturgis wrote for a number of so-called straight publications, as did Andrew Lumsden, formerly plying his trade at the Times. The gay subculture that had begun to develop in London was not completely independent of the society that surrounded them, be that in a positive or in a negative sense. Despite this similarity, the community context of the papers changes the meaning of these reproduced words. In Sturgis's account, although the words are the same, they take on a different meaning. The insider context makes this less of a unique pantomime and more of a celebratory statement of fact. We see how then the editorial position of a paper and its readership can transform a narrative, even when the same words are written. The first three accused, Chappell, MacDougall and Bourne, would not face trial that day, as a key police witness, in the vein of professionalism we've come to expect from the Metropolitan Police, forgot to show up. With the first group remanded, the magistrate could feel the palpable tension in the well-dressed public gallery. It might have been masked behind sarcastic tittering and good-natured fun, but it was there. There was to be an adjournment before Lumsden and Reed's case would be heard. The court would have to be cleared out, but laughter from the public gallery quickly turned into anger.
"You old queen, how dare you sit in judgment on us gays?"
called out one of the defendants, insinuating that Mr. Harrington was himself a homosexual. Despite this accusation, the courtroom was still cleared. It was a curious sensation to emerge from the cool judicial atmosphere of the court into the front line of yet another grand confrontation between the police and the Gay Liberation Front, Sturgis reported. Rumours were rife. One of them was that Michael, the defendant's dockside friend, would not be allowed back in. "As for not being allowed back into the public gallery, that was too much, my dear. Do they really expect us to lie down under this perversion of British justice?" came the call from one observer. The anger outside the courtroom was palpable. Bejewelled fists were raised, swollen carotids throbbed under makeup, and nerve endings were exposed. Calls went up from the crowd. "Sheer victimisation! That's what it is! Bloody pig oppression! Just because we're gay! Oh, they'll regret this!" The crowd, now ostensibly a gay liberation protest group, attempted to, according to Sturgis, play the authority baiting game through putting arms around the police and once more blowing kisses at the officers. The police constables attached to the court decided to be provoked and simply swarmed down from some top stair cop hive and joined hands, no, not in that way, to ease out the brothers and sisters from the court precinct. Overcoming any mild nausea they felt, the police employed the minimum of force necessary to expel screaming brood hens onto the steps outside. Much to everyone's disappointment, there were no broken limbs or fractured skulls. In the midst of this confrontation, a police constable emerged from the courtroom, tapping Michael, the advisor, on the shoulder. "Magistrate wants to see you. In there." The trial could finally now resume, with a limited number of people in the public gallery. Sturgis's account of the brawl in the corridors is laced with sardonic humour and pointed commentary on the futility of this endeavour. The motives of the assembled crowd were clear to him. It was cosier and infinitely more titillating for them to see themselves, and other gays, as the victims of a jackbooted fascist state. In a way, we can see similarities between Sturgis's representation here and the way that the Marylebone Mercury reported on the preliminary performance of drag at the beginning of the trial. As an ego-tripping piece of vaudeville, the performance was hilarious, but it hardly presented the gay movement in the best light, and from a public relations standpoint, proved embarrassingly counterproductive. For Sturgis, this confrontation only reinforced the stereotype of the hysterical, infantile homosexual that had emerged within the public view. And if we reflect on the Mercury's report of this particular confrontation, we can see that such a view was not particularly unfounded. Sturgis's view of Lumsden's laser-focused questioning of landlord Mahone's prejudices was much more positive. His case stated clearly, and his own rights to a legal advisor were defended through fortitude rather than through spectacle. Returning to Lumsden and Reed's case, the court later ruled that neither of them were guilty of using aggressive or threatening language, but their conduct in the face of the police presence at the pub was indeed so-called threatening behaviour. They were both ordered to pay a fine of £5, with a suspended fine of £20 to be paid if they disturb the peace within the next 12 months. If we adjust this for inflation, that's only £57 and £230 respectively. This was at a magistrate's court, after all. It wasn't a particularly high-profile case. It wouldn't have been a custodial sentence by any means. Now, Lumsden and Reed, they might have felt a little bit hard done by. But, as Sturgis so pointedly argued, this wasn't the actions of a fascist police state, as some GLF members had claimed and argued on the steps of the courtroom. Sturgis concluded his account not with the verdict, but with an observation. Overall, the trial came across as an object lesson in comparative tactics. The spoiled child dramatisations were not proof against the firm good humour of the police. Conversely, Andrew Lumsden's cultivated detachment and incisive, rapier-like thrusts rattled the court and came very near to beating it at its own game. Such tactics generate respect, not only for the individual concerned, but for the homophile movement as a whole. Now, no one with his eyes open can help being aware of the many instances of police oppression, not only against gays, but potentially against all underprivileged members of the community. We are agreed on our strategy. It only remains to reach a working consensus on tactics. As a member of the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, which was a more gradualist organisation than the Gay Liberation Front, Sturgis's distaste for the performative disruption of the Gay Liberation Front members makes sense. His assessment brings into focus the fractured nature of the gay rights movement at this juncture in history. Of course, the Gay Liberation Front itself, the protagonist at the heart of much of this trial, would go on to be split in 1974 into a variety of different organisations, such as Switchboard, a charity that provided, and still to this day, provides a helpline for LGBT people across the UK. Organisations like Gay News, the newspaper which would go to supplant Lunch as the premier magazine of the London gay rights movement. Indeed, this newspaper was set up with the help of members of the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, and one of the founding members of that newspaper was Andrew Lumsden himself, the protagonist of this particular trial. And also the organisation Icebreakers, which would eventually become Gays the Word, the bookshop where the Gays and Lesbians Support the Minors of Pride fame was founded. The torch of radical demonstration that the GLF had left in its wake was carried on by Outrage, an organisation which had very similar tactics to the GLF in terms of performance, disruption and protest. Going back to 1972 though, the discussion, the debate and the future of the gay rights movement was very much in question. Was action like that taken at Marylebone Court truly disrupting the oppressive power of the state, or was it just reinforcing negative stereotypes that could be used by the straight press and by people who wanted to keep down queer expression? Was a gradualist concept, beating the system at its own game, truly a way to show the gay community as a united but respectable whole? Or did it sacrifice queerness at the altar of straight respectability? These were genuine questions that abounded in a less than united gay community, and Sturgis's account of that day in Marylebone gives us a first-hand view of that debate. Through this, we can move beyond a presentist vision of gay counterculture in the 1970s and begin to see it for the vibrant, diverse, yet disunited phenomenon community that it was. We should not be like the Mercury and stereotype. Queer people are not and have never been a monolith. Queerness manifests itself in an almost infinite number of ways, and through this case, at a key juncture in queer identity's formation, we can begin to see historical, present and future queerness as the complex and unique state of being that it always has been. Thank you for listening to this episode of Paper Lives. It was written and performed by Tommy Hanmer, with special thanks to our guest performers. We are also grateful to the British Newspaper Archive and the Bishopsgate Institute for their extensive collections. If you want to know more about this topic, please go to our website www.paperlivespodcast.wordpress.com, where you will find an accompanying blog and links to further resources. Once again, thank you for listening, and tune in next time for another Paper Life.